School is in. But are you really ready to learn? Open your eyes to a new day in education with The Awakening Educator, a program specifically designed to explore a new, mindful way of educating our youth. Learn about social-emotional learning, new modalities of teaching, and the most relevant topics in education with your hosts, Susan Andrian and Megan Sweet. Susan and Megan will take you inside the issues by looking at them from different points of view, from policies and research to teaching models that are actually used in schools. There's never a dull moment in this classroom. Have any questions you'd like to ask? Maybe you have knowledge you'd like to share. And share your thoughts live on air. Grab a pen and paper and get ready to open your textbooks and minds to a new way of learning on The Awakening Educator.
Hi, welcome. This is The Awakening Educator, and I'm Susan Andrian.
I'm Megan Sweet.
And we are super excited today to have here Jamie Morantz, who is a longtime educator, held lots of roles, long time. And we're excited to talk about what we think is really exciting, but sometimes, it's hard to get a lot of motivation up talking about, but it's such an important topic. We're moving into our 3-part series on looking under the hood. Educators might know it as operations, but it's the things that make schools go. And today we're going to focus on education finance. And so we're really excited to be able to talk about the money and hear about it from a lot of different perspectives. So welcome, Jamie. Welcome to the Awakening Educator. We're super excited to have you here. And maybe you can introduce yourself rather than me or Megan just reading your bio.
Wow. I started my career in Oakland. I was a science teacher back in the day at Skyline. And I was there before Skyline kind of died. I actually watched that happen, and that really influenced my career a lot, because in a 2-year time frame, you had a school that was doing pretty well, all things considered. There was a lot of drama about Skyline in general, and then wasn't, and basically has not recovered. So that was a really big influence in my life. And then I ended up teaching at Berkeley and became activities coordinator there. And that's a whole nother saga and a half. And then I came back to Oakland and became an assistant principal at Westlake, then principal at Edna Brewer Middle School. And that was really the meat of my career in terms of doing anything really meaningful. Became network executive officer. Me and Gia Trung became partners over the 20 middle schools. And we basically brought to them what we had brought to our school in terms of data-driven kind of instruction, focusing on just 2 really fundamental pieces. And within 2 years, 75% of the middle schools all had significant increases. It kind of blew everybody's mind. And then, of course, we got a new superintendent, and they went another way. And so that was the end of that. And so then I went down somewhere else. I went down to North Monterey County Unified School District, became assistant superintendent there, had a SIG school there, an elementary school. It was one of the worst. And totally, we turned that thing around in 3 years. That was awesome. Came back, did some PD and stuff at the county, and then worked with some charters over the last couple of years to either create a middle school for Envision, worked with that team to create a great middle school out in Hayward, actually, with their high school. And then went over to Ed for Change to work with them on their middle grades program, and retired. But then I'm still kind of working a little, coaching some teachers. And I feel very, very, very lucky to just have a part-time teacher coaching position where I don't have to write any LCAPs or program any of the millions of things that you have to do. So here I am.
That was the quick.
You're fast. That's an incredibly, I think knowing you and knowing your reputation, Jamie, I think it's, you not only just did all these things, but actually you've been a really transformational leader. So the schools that you've worked in and the places where you've worked, to say you've turned around a school in 3 years, Susan and I actually know how hard that is. And most people who are educators know how hard that is. And you didn't just turn that one around. You turned around the school where you were the principal. At Edna Brewer was, not on the map, and has since your imprint been nothing but on the map for the last 15 years.
Yeah, so we're excited to talk with you about how schools work.
I had the opportunity to work with Jamie as my principal, and it really was an honor, and to see how you ran that school, like just and how you were able to really connect with all the kids, and it was such this unique place because it's on that line of in Oakland, it's on this line of like affluent hill schools and flatland, and every student in that school got what they needed. And I think a lot of it was the way you creatively looked at budgets and thought about meeting kids. So I know it's bringing us back in there, but you were so tenacious in making sure that kids got what they needed, and we're excited to talk about that. But it also, that time that I had with you influences everything that I do now still. So it was an honor to work in that school, and it was an honor to work with you. So I
was just going to say the same thing, Susan, and this is like the Jamie Morantz, like sparkles and rainbows hour, which I think is perfect and deserved. But I was going to say, actually, I've seen Jamie's imprint because I've worked with a lot of principals that followed after you, or the APs that worked with you. And there have been a lot of really smart people trying to chase the magic that you were able to create in the schools that you created. I'm sure that's everywhere you've went. So it'd be great to try and call some of that magic and understand a little bit about it. Right before we got on the show, one of the things Jamie and I were talking about was why she felt like she could make some of the moves she could in her middle school at Brewer around budget. So we thought maybe we could start there of like, budgeting is one of those things that I like to joke around about, that when people ask me what my dissertation was, I can watch them like mentally, if not physically, like walk backward and try and escape because it feels so boring or not interesting. But I think it's a really fascinating and important part of education because
it's where the power is.
Where the power is where the transformation can be. And so knowing how to use that effectively, which I feel like most educators frankly don't, is a real issue, or they can't, one or the other. So anyway, Jamie, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you got interested in budgets, or how you started to see the influence of budgets when you became a principal.
So when I became principal, there had been such a mess at the school the year before that about 2 weeks before school started, I got a call from downtown saying, oh, by the way, you can't spend any of your categorical money. So the way it used to be, the funding is slightly different now, but similar. You have this bunch of what they call unrestricted funds. You can spend it on almost anything, not trips to the Bahamas, apparently. And then you had, money that was targeted for use for kids who, were either English learners or foster youth or, Title I, poverty, et cetera, right? And so a large part of the budget of a school like Brewer was those categorical funds. And so right away, I was like, we can't spend that money. What? Oh, you didn't have a legal SSC. You had to do all these things. So I got to call up a bunch of people and say, I don't have a job for you. So I didn't have a job for the nurse and some instructional facilitator. And they were spending their money on the strangest things. Not to say the kids don't need healthcare and nursing. I get that. But at a school where 5% of your African-American population, but which were proficient, 5%, and they're 40% of your school. And when you look at the special ed kids, I showed this data when I first got there, 7% of my special ed kids were proficient. And yet 60% of them were special ed. So, we're African-American as well. So only special ed African-American kids were proficient. I was like, what the heck is going on? This is not okay, right? So anyway, so that was a big drama that I couldn't spend that money, but it was great. It actually ended up being great because I was able to then get an SSC together with staff and parents, right?
School Site Council.
Together. School Site Council, thank you. Right, you have to have a community group as well as teachers and other people in your community approve basically these monies. And so we got together and we looked at a lot of data, which I think is really important. And I think that looking at data to decide what you're going to do is the bedrock of everything I ever did. And what I'd like to say about that is that I've seen people look at data and in such a way that it didn't matter, wasn't powerful or understandable for people. in which case then people just hate it and want to run away, right? So part of the job of a principal is to actually figure out how to interpret that data, not to do it for them, to show them the data, walk through the data, but in a way that is comprehensible. So, right, and so at that point is when we started changing how we were spending some of that money. For example, I found out things like we just didn't have enough textbooks. There was one set of history textbooks for the entire 6th grade, and they like passed them around. And I was just like aghast, right? There were just so many things that just were so, just needed to be fixed right away. So that's the first thing I did is I just went around and found all the things that needed to be fixed, that were broken, literally kids sitting on broken furniture, just horrible things. And I removed obstacles. That's how I consider it. The administrator's job is to remove obstacles. And then I found out that, I think it was the following year, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Ward came in as a state administrator and changed the way budgets were done in Oakland. Traditionally, the way budgets are done at schools is somebody downtown looks at your school and says, oh, you have this many children. Okay, the contract says you get 32 kids per teacher. I do the math for you and I say you get 18 teachers. Oh, you have this many kids, you get this kind of secretary. Oh, you have this many kids, you don't get a librarian, you only get whatever it is. They basically tell you how you're spending most of your money, because between 90 and 90% of your money is spent on people. So if they've already told me all the people I can have and who they are and what they can do at my site, as an administrator, that's very, very ties your hands, very, very much so. So I was super lucky to be in a situation where they didn't do that. They basically said, here's all the money. Here are the things you can and cannot spend all these different, what we call categorical monies on, right? And then I sat down with people and I said, okay, what do we need? What do my kids need? Who are the kids that are not getting things? What's going on? How can we serve them better this way? And we got very creative with budgeting that I would not have been able to do. So for example, when we went through what does a good middle school look like? How is a good middle school when it's academically excellent? When there's social equity, right? And when there's developmentally responsive situations for kids that are 11 to 13, because they're not children and they're not teenagers. There's something in between. And you actually need to address that, right? They need belonging, they need care, they need attention, they need us all on the same page, a bunch of things. So we looked at everything we were doing through those lenses. And so when people say, oh, I did this, I didn't do it. I took people through this journey, right? And they made all of these thoughts and decisions, like they wanted there to be what we ended up calling families. So we took each grade level and divided them in half and had 4 teachers that had all those kids, and the other 4 teachers had all these kids, right? And the only way we could do that was with this creative budgeting, because otherwise they would have only given me this many teachers for that grade level, or this many, I can't remember what it was. And I wouldn't have been able to do that structurally. So that created a lot of, and that's still going on at Brewer, right? Yeah. And through the third principle, not because of me, but because it worked and because we continued every 3 to 6 weeks to look at data to see what was working, what wasn't. We changed things that did. We brought in a culture of, I would just say, response, right? As well as planning for the needs of our students. So changing things wasn't like insane. Like, how can you change something? Well, because we went through these steps to decide what needed to be changed. And then we would look at it and say, did that work? Did it not? And that's very hard in an institution to kind of, I would say, create a culture where change, not just random madness every 3 weeks, something. I've been there, right? Yeah. But that you plan and you strategize and people work together for the benefit of the outcomes, and you look at the outcomes and it's what you look back on.
Well, so there was another thing that was happening during that time, that was during the small school movement in Oakland, right? Everybody was breaking up into these small schools. But one of the things that I always reflect back on in that experience is brewers seem to be creating the small school experience with the benefit financially of a larger school, because you would have more money, but using the families would allow the experience of having those relational small houses. But when you have that many more kids, you have a lot more money to spend in creative ways that support students in like a university almost model.
Exactly. So if I have 750 kids, I have one secretary. But if you now give me a school with 325 kids, I got to have a secretary, I got to have custodians, I got to have, like, you take away, you know, exactly the sort of power of scale. And so to keep the money for the large, you know, and become more efficient, we were able to have a larger proportion of our money spent on things like extra classes, electives. Like, we were actually able to hire a music teacher. And all of you know, like Zach Pitt-Smith, I gotta say, the best thing I ever did was hire that man. And I did some good stuff. I had some good people I hired there, but damn, I don't know.
After me. But he's
still there, Susan. And
no, I know he's still there.
Have you seen the movie Soul?
Yeah.
Those are my kids. Those are his kids. Like, anyway, so that, you know, like, there's so many things that we thought about when we thought about what makes for a really vibrant experience. It's not just math and English, right? It's truly, when I say the whole child, I mean, like, kids should be able to weld, right? I mean, we actually did drag them over for welding in an after school program once I got parents to drive. It was crazy, but just saying.
Well, I think how do you do that though, Jamie? Because I think that's the trick.
And he's not the only teacher.
I know that.
Go ahead.
Morgan. Sorry. I got my peeps. They're all awesome.
You did some great hires. I think what I would be interesting to hear you talk about, because I've led these conversations too, and they're tricky. And I think it's what scares school leaders from opening up people to this discussion. So you described a few things that I think are important. One is you showed everybody the data and you got everybody on the same page, and you asked them critical questions that drove people towards looking at data and understanding it. And you also shifted the culture to be looking at data regularly and being used to change and shifting, which educators definitely don't like to do. Humans don't like to change. So, you know, it makes people feel real tense. So you normalize that. But one of the things I've seen time and time again with school leaders is this paralysis or deep fear of engaging with others around budgeting things and around identifying what those priority items are. Because, you know, everybody comes in with their pet projects. I like to pick on gardening because that's my favorite one to pick on. And I love gardening. I am a gardener, but, like, you know, the number of parents are like, what we need is a school garden. I'm like, no, we have kids that aren't reading, actually. So I would rather we spend on reading right now. And if we can get grant money for a garden, fine. But, like, how do you host that conversation so that people feel heard, especially in a school where you have parents with privilege and money and parents without, and you found a way to get everybody on the same page?
But I want to remind people of this. First year I was at Brewer, we had less than like 2 or 3% white kids. Like, I knew all 5 of the white kids at my school by name, and they were all fascinating children. Like, they were unique it was just, anyway, very small percentage of white kids at that school. We had mostly African-American, Southeast Asian kids, some Chinese, Latino. It was actually the most diverse middle school in Oakland. And to this day, it is still really diverse, even though I think now they're like at 15% white, maybe a little bit more. So when I first came in, I had a much smaller group of white parents to deal with. And the parents that I had were actually a phenomenal group. This is another thing that I absolutely was so lucky about, the budgeting and these parents. There was a group of parents that came from Crocker that was actually a mixed group of people: African-American people, Latino people, white people, Asian people. It was an interesting community group of people who came in when I came in, basically with their kids. As some of them had come in the year before, and what they had tried to do, and this is why I was like, I'm not down with this. They tried to make a little baby school within a school for their children. I don't want to talk about a certain high school in Oakland that does this with their special program that all the special children go together in, which is, again, another middle school not that far away from us was also like that. And that's how they attracted their white kids, is they put them all in the honors track or whatever the hell they call that thing. And so when I came in, they had already started that. And I was like, oh, no, we can't do that. So I was like, how am I going to do this and not lose them? So basically, we got on board with like, if this is good for your kid, then this is good for all kids. And if it's good for all kids, then we should work together to create a system like this for everybody. And they were actually down with that. They were people who, you know, grew up when Kennedy asked you shit like, don't ask what you can do for your country, but what your country can do for you people, right? They were like, they had some community, I don't even know what you call it, which we've so lost in this country, as the last 4 years have shown us. But anyway, so.
Like a sense of civics almost.
Yeah, right. And there were a couple people who left because the first year it was a really rough, these cute little 6th grade, little blonde haired girls, like mixed in with the whole giant thing, right? But most of them stuck with it and saw that we could get it done, and they were great. So that was very, very helpful. And then part of the other thing that people don't do when they do reform is first of all, we had this framework to use that I said before, the academically excellent, social equity, and developmental responsiveness piece. And then I had them examine other schools. So we did like a whole, like, here's how 5 other schools have gone after these ideas. The idea is what's important, not the structure, right? And I also used a problem-solving matrix that basically, you can't 100%, but mostly removed the idea of this is Jamie's idea, this is Susan's idea, this is Megan's idea. Well, I don't like Megan, so I'm not going to do. We don't want to do that. We didn't do that. We had a whole where we created a must-have, should have, and then that'd be nice kind of, and then we created, you know, a set of what are the things that absolutely, if we're going to do blank, change the schedule, what's the schedule got to do for us? Okay, so these are the things we want the schedule to do for us before we ever look at schedules, right? Now we look, and then you can put each of the different ideas that are generated another time and sort of become anonymized. You don't know who did it, blah, 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 come out of a box. And then you put each one publicly through the sieves. And then after a while, it's like, these things meet that, these don't, and then you don't make everyone do it all at once. We did pilots. So we started with a group of teachers who were interested, for example, in looping. And guess what? People were coming to me in the middle of the year going, how come I didn't loop? I want to loop. I want to roll. And everybody, they love it. I'm like, oh, okay, you go, how everybody can loop next year, you know? That's the other thing. Like, people have to come to things, you know, you can't make people do anything. And I say this all the time in education, you cannot mandate heart. And heart is what makes the difference. So if you can't inspire and give people true leadership and true, what I call valency, like I can say something, I can make a difference, I can have input to this. Like, people are willing to say, okay, because our team's going to do this, I'll do it too, even if it's not my favorite thing, because there are other times where your idea is kind of the idea that we ended up like going for. So I think there's a lot of pieces in that. And then the budget was everything. Because I know we're supposed to be talking about budget. It was everything. We did stuff like, so the math teachers had, because of the way we broke it all up, there were 5 periods, core periods a day. 4 of them were their core classes, and then 1 was their intervention. And so that meant that I was able to pay 20% of their salary out of Title I. So I got extra teachers, right? Can't hire a whole teacher do Title I. Well, you can, and I've never seen that be very effective, where you hire the one reading specialist, they work with like 1 kid at a period or something. Yeah, the impact is for the dollar. Yeah. And then we did the same thing with English. So the English teachers took the kids who were, you know, struggling and had an extra period with them. And because they knew their curriculum and what they were doing, they, over several years, let me tell you, because I've seen lots of intervention classes that are just horrible. But over a couple of year period, again, of constantly looking at how we were doing it, what we were doing, they designed a system that eventually really became very effective for kids in those situations. And then I was able to buy the music teacher, right? And then like I got a Spanish teacher and she wanted to teach dance. Great. So, you know, we were able to attract, because that's the other thing, you want to attract people to a robust and a vibrant program, and you want to address the kids who need extra academic help, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can't do one or the other. You have to do both, because these kids who need academic help also need stuff that's fun and engaging and exciting, right? Like, so yeah, it's not enough to teach people math and English, because then they elect somebody like Trump.
Right.
They can't think. Thinking is really important to me, right? So,
and thinking about the budget, because you had help with that, like you had Gabe, you had people that knew money that were helping you with that piece, right? So that thinking, and we were talking about this before, that there are principals who really understand instruction and really understand what they want, but they don't necessarily understand, they haven't been trained, they may have been educators who have no idea how to actually make the budget work for them. How did you make your budget work for you? Like what were the supports that put that in place?
Well, so I had to understand it. And I actually think that the job of principal is ridiculous. You're supposed to be an education expert. You're supposed to be a budget expert. You're supposed to be like kind of almost like a social worker expert. You're also supposed to be a legal expert, right? You're supposed to know everything about special ed and how to not get your butt sued off. And, you know, there's just so many, and you're supposed to actually be a manager of adults, which, by the way, is a whole thing of itself, right? Like nobody teaches you that in whether you're a teacher or in admin training. No one talks to you about how do you inspire and manage adults. It's hard. And, you know, we have a weird profession. Teacher does not really, what's the right one? You train you up to be principal. Like those two jobs are very different. And yet it's super important that principals actually have been teachers, because there's no way to understand what life is like. I have never once in my life for 1 second forgot what it was like to be a teacher for 13 years, right? And I remember when Gia and I first became Nexos and we looked at each other. We used to go to these things called principal prison every other week for like, I don't know, hours and hours. We literally called it that, principal prison. And I looked at her and she looked at me, I said, we are never doing principal prison. And she's like, damn straight. You know, and it was the same thing with PD. I'm not going to do the PDs that I sat through. When I was a principal, I'm like, I'm not doing PD that I sat through. That was a big waste of my time, everybody's time. I'm not doing that. So changing how we did things to focus on instruction was important. But anyway, so I understood budget pretty okay, just because why? Well, you know, I think when I was activities coordinator at Berkeley High, which is a huge school, there was a ton of money that came in and went out in my world there. And a lot of it was just raised from tickets and stuff. But when you're doing like 3 proms a year with over 1,000 kids at each prom, and they're paying you 40, 50, 75 bucks a ticket, like that's a bunch of money. And money so I've started to learn about object codes and categorical stuff and the legal things and how you could collect money and couldn't collect money. So, and then Charlene, my principal at Westlake, was brilliant with budget, smart woman, and told me, just said, hey, look, you don't got to do that. You can do this. See how that can be like that? I'm like, ooh, that's so clever. And also, I'm like not a very fearful person. So I would often go downtown and say, look, I see this money here. I don't have money here. Can I do this? Can this? Nope, that can't move there, but that could move there. And then that could move there. I'm like, oh, then now I could say, oh, okay. So I would just go ask my little finance woman, Dunn, what was her name? Something Dunn. She was great. And because I knew that it was at the heart of what would make it better. But I will also say this, Oakland systems were horrible, like horrible. Literally Gabe, the wonderful man who eventually ended up helping with this, and then eventually Rob, and then eventually Esperanza. We literally created our own system at our school to like they would say that the PO had been sent. So and they would call and go down there weekly. And then we would call each company, did you get the PO? And then because the other thing that in Oakland is if they didn't pay the PO by June 1st or May 30th or whatever their magic date was, they would just take that money out of your money next year. I remember the first year I was there, I bought all this like library furniture, $10,000 worth of furniture. And I was like so excited. And then like in August, I got this call saying, oh yeah. And I'm like, what happened to that $10,000? Am I, oh yeah, your library. I'm like, no, my library's last year. Come to find out, they don't actually like reconcile in the way that needs to be reconciled. So anyway, so we ended up calling the companies. Did you get the invoice? Did you pay the invoice? Okay, great. And then I send someone downtown. Did you get this check? Like literally I had to hire somebody to do the work that should have been done at the district level in because and it wasn't their fault as individuals. It was mostly because they had antiquated systems. You know, imagine 100 and some schools buying things every day from God only knows how many places, and you're faxing things in a fax machine. Like, are you kidding me? How do you know it got there? I don't know, right? So
the fax machines, but it was around for a long time.
Yes.
One of the things you're naming, Jamie, that I just feel like I feel like I'm often like the one that's like, let me summarize the ideas. This seems to be because this is how I think. So I heard a few things that feel important, which is one, like you built coalitions. So I think often what happens is that people feel like they have to do it all on their own. And so you built buy-in, you listened to people.
Yep. You
allowed people to feel heard and also to lead into their areas of expertise, and you saw where the need was and you went there, which I think often people just don't do. The other thing that I heard you say, which I think is often true of really effective leaders and ones that end up being good at budgets, is you're willing to kind of poke at it a little bit and ask questions. And people don't often want to ask questions or get creative. And the biggest shame I've seen with budgeting is people just recreate the wheel every single time because they're afraid to think creatively. So they just like, and there's a lot of things in district budgets that look like that. We're like, well, we've always spent money on XYZ companies, so that's why we're going to do it. It's like, well, why? We always do it this way. Well, why? And that why question often doesn't come up. And therefore people end up, even if they don't have a lot of money to play with, they kind of dwindle it because it's just kind of, they just repeat over the same activities over and over again. And so I think I heard you doing that, and that's powerful and important.
And I don't want you to think that it was easy and that just because we got together and there were coalitions and everyone was happy. Like at one point we wanted to change, especially when you talk about changing staffing, right? Like we wanted to go from a librarian to a textbook clerk because apparently every year we lost $30,000 in textbooks, even though we had a librarian. So librarian that wasn't part of their job. And I'm like, well, if I'm paying for you and I'm paying $30,000 a year for textbooks, I could just hire a textbook clerk for $30,000 and then I'd save all that money and we could buy the textbooks. But that did not make everyone happy, right? So not only do you have to be willing to poke, not only do you have to be willing to get coalitions and get a really strong like group of people together with you, you actually do have to be willing to stand in the breach and take it when it's not a popular move, because change is hard for people, even when they think they want it. Even when, like, this, like that whole thing of just getting married is one of the most stressful events in your life, even though you think you really want it, right? change is hard. And
not everybody came along with you. There were many people, many who decided that the direction you were going was not for them, and they left.
Right. And I would say
you can't please everyone, and you have to accept that you're not going to please everyone. And what you're describing, Jamie, I describe as the shamrock hat. And the reason why I describe it as that is that while you were at your middle school, I was at an elementary school, basically doing a lot of the same stuff with a different principal. I was the assistant principal. And one of the things we asked the teachers to do was, we gave them a lot of latitude around their instructional program, but what we always asked them to do was just tell us how it's like, what goal are you reaching for every single thing that you're doing during the day? I should be able to know why you're doing it. Why is it important? How is it leveraging the learning and expanding the learning for our kids? And then I'll leave you alone, but you have to tell me why. And we went into a kindergarten classroom, and the kids were, it was St. Patrick's Day. The kids are coloring, and they're drawing in their shamrock hats, and they're, cutting them out and the whole thing. And I asked the teacher, I was like, okay, cool. Well, what learning objective is this associated with? And she couldn't give me one. You could actually find them if you wanted to, but she hadn't made that intentional connection. And therefore she wasn't leveraging that opportunity for her kids in the right way. Right. And so I had that conversation with her, and I was like, well, so she came into my office later and was like, trying to defend her shamrock hat thing still. And I was like, well, if you can't tell me why, you have to let it go. Like, if you don't have a good reason for this, because her reasoning was like, well, we do it every year and the kids like it. I'm like, that's not, like, we don't have a minute to spare with these babies. Unless you can tell me why it's important, we can't do it.
Right.
And so for me, I feel like the budget is often these little shamrock hats where it's what we've always done. We've always had a librarian and there's a reason for it. But if you can't actually connect, and librarians were especially unpopular, but if you can't connect the librarian with those other outcomes, then then that becomes a shamrock hat role, and you have to have that conversation. You either find why it's important and you connect it, or you have to replace it with the thing that you need, like having a textbook clerk instead of having a librarian. And those aren't popular conversations.
They're emotionally connected. Both of those things are coming from an emotional place rather than an intellectual place. And so it feels like you're attacking their hearts, but you're not.
That person.
Their
identity.
Yeah.
And it's really about, we have to be able to, understand why we're doing things. It has to be outcome driven.
We don't have a minute to spare. And so I think that can be really hard, and you just have to get used to it. That's so inspiring, Jamie. I know you're not in the school now. I told you I was going to ask you this question, but it's my big wondering. As you think about budgets, or about like, okay, we've all been away from school, in a school building, and there's lots of recovery that needs to happen. How would you go about prioritizing the work ahead, even if you're old school or out of school, or even understanding what the needs are, as we're imagining returning from COVID-19 and being away? Like, what goes through your mind, or what would go through your mind of like, how do I start to assess what are the shamrock hats? What are the priorities, and how do I start to move my school community there in this time that's so fraught? I'm just wondering, because you're such an experienced leader, what might go through your mind around that?
Well, it's funny because, like I said, I am coaching a couple teachers, some math science teachers at a K-8 school right now. And so even though I'm not responsible, I'm there and I'm seeing like just how it is for people, kids, parents, whatever, like, the administrators. First of all, I think that the district, the way we budget in California is problematic in many, many ways. You probably know this. We used to be a very highly funded state, and now we're actually better than we were a couple of years ago. We're like at the bottom third, a little lower than the average of what is spent in the United States, which is a problem because that below average, and then try to live in the Bay Area or LA and have a house, then all of that impacts things like teachers. Because I just spent 4 years at school, then I had to go another year minimally, which is, again, another problem, that in California, you can have a 1-year degree or less to become a teacher. There's just a lot of issues with personnel at this moment in our lives in California that is super real. So that is a much different scenario than I had. And the fact that in California, the budget can vary so widely year to year because of the whole Prop 13 and the way we fund education. And it ends up that we all thought we were going to have no money next year. And I just read the budget thing, and apparently we're going to have more money next year than this year, which I don't understand where they found it, but okay, great. And then the next thing is, okay, comes to the district. Now you have that bucket of unrestricted, and now you have what they call the LCFF funds, right? What are called now concentration and supplemental. And those, it's supposedly more flexible, but the reporting looks awful. I have friends who are, I'm like, ugh. They've just made, in other words, they continue to add layers and layers and layers sort of this idea of super uber accountability, and that'll make everything better. That actually doesn't. You can look all around the world at effective schools and states even that are more effective than us, whether it's Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, New York, where they spend twice as much money almost as we do. But they also have less of this ridiculous waste that we have in California. For example, let's just tiny example here, and then I'll come back to your question. Student information system. Student information system is something you absolutely have to have because it keeps all your student information safe, right?
Like Aries? Is that like Aries?
Yes,
okay.
yes. And it reports to the state, and that's how the state decides to pay you, is through your ADA, your average daily attendance. And they get that information from your student information system, right? Okay, so in California, every single district has to buy their own student information system out of the money they get. Okay, which means they don't talk to each other very well. And if you move from district to district, stuff's a big mess, right? In Connecticut, the state created, bought, hired a couple of programmers, made a student information system that's just there. Every school uses it. Everywhere you go, you have the same number. Every time you move, your stuff is right there with you, right? Mm-hmm. And when I train people in West Bahunkie to use the student information system and they move to East Bahunkie, well, guess what? They know how to use it. So if you just think about the amount of training, the amount of money, the amount of greed, what, it's crazy. And it's the basis for our entire system, the student information system. And so
either of you know about how much we pay for Oakland Unified or for the system?
It's expensive. Mm-hmm. It's expensive. I don't remember because when I was at Norris County, we ended up changing from one to another. And I think it was around at the time $15 a kid. It can range from $15 to $25 a student. That's correct. Depending on what it does. Does it also have an assessment system in it? Does it not? This other stuff, right? But I'm just saying, that's an example of waste and mismanagement and inefficiency, right? You have your special ed staff in a district, then you have the county special ed people who bother you. You have now this thing called a SELPA. It's like nobody else even knows what the hell that is in this country. And then you have the state, and then you got the feds. So special ed people are writing 5 different reports on the exact same thing, on the exact same set of stuff. All of this extra baggage is incredibly inefficient. So and then that leads me to the district. How is the district giving funds to their schools? Are they saying, here's all your money, you decide how to spend it within the legal parameters? For example, you still have a contract. I couldn't put 38 kids in some teacher's class just because I felt like it, because the contract wouldn't let me do that, right? How much flexibility will the district, how much faith will the district have in their own leaders is a really important question. What is being spent at the district level and how efficient is it, right? And how much should be at the school site, I think is a big question. And so, we keep looking up from the teacher to the principal saying, oh, it's the bad principal is the reason we don't have this money. Very often the principal has very little say about how much money they get and how they can spend that money. So that's my first thing is, if you don't trust your principals, that's on you. Train them. Right? What gets checked on gets done. So what kind of meetings are you having with principals, and what are you training them on, and how are you keeping them I actually got freaking awards in Oakland for simply spending my money.
I remember. I got. I remember you had a couple of those awards, the budget awards.
Right. But I had to hire somebody so I could spend all my money because the system was so broken, right? I'm like, anybody can spend their money if their system works. But I think anyway, I don't know. It was hard. Let me just say that. And contracts, and there's so much stuff. So first of all, I would say districts freaking let go. Right? Let go and help them be flexible, but train them, teach them, help them with how do you bring people together? And, it's like, hey, you have an SSC, go deal with that. How do you bring those people together? How do you help show them what your school is, what the needs are? How does the principal even know? How is this how are you helping them with this? And then the same thing you said, what's the reason you're doing this, Mr. or Miss Principal, right? Like somebody, a budget person should be helping them. Like, you say these are your goals, right? Do these actions actually get at these goals, right? Or are they tangential? A lot of times people are like, that's nice. It's touching the edge of that thing you want to do, but how will you know if this is the right move? Like, again, are we going to look at data in 6 months, or how are we going to know we're spending our money right? So to just revamp the way we think about money, I think is really important. District 2's site. And if that means that they have a special budget person, and they've tried this in Oakland, right, who comes and works with you and helps you. And I think that was helpful for some people. I don't know if you had that. There's that. And then the second is absolutely, as a principal, it's important to look at data. And it's very hard right now to look at data because everyone says everything is an artifact of distance learning. So I want to bring kids back for hybrid. And how am I going to do that? That's what I mean about flexibility. You may have a teacher that's 68 years old, great teacher, but is worried about coming back because of COVID. So maybe that person becomes a distance teacher. This is a time, I think, that's wonderful in a lot of ways. I kind of like it because, wow, think of all the things you could do that you never thought about you could do before. And,
that's been central to our conversation for sure. Megan and I have both been hammering that idea of reimagination, and this is the opportunity. And even going back to that conversation we had with teachers, we're like, we can't tolerate what we've tolerated for so long in terms of what kids haven't been getting. And so how do we reimagine? And we need to be thoughtful with our money to reimagine. And then when you put in all those complicated layers of the state and the federal and the district and and I'm always experiencing the dilemma between the autonomy of the site, which you're advocating for right here, and also the things that should be centralized. And I almost feel like we have them swapped. The things that should be centralized and support sites like the student in like areas and information system and all of that, and those things that should be more like taken off of the plate. And then the things that we should be giving principals autonomy on, as long as it's driven on data and as long as it's sort of grounded in best practice in some way. But I feel like sometimes we're moving so fast, it's flipped. So how do we reimagine now that we're in that moment? What would you recommend the district level do to help give the sites because you've been at both, you've been a principal, you've been at the district, you've been a network, superintendent, you've been pretty much at the state. So like where do we start to untangle this to get to the reimagining?
I do think that there has to be some willingness for the district to really take a hard look at themselves, how they're organized, and how they support site leaders through this. I think that just like how teachers, all of us, were taken aback. Like this was a scenario that nobody prepared for. We've prepared for strikes, right? And we made giant binders of lessons. That wouldn't have done us any good, right? This was something that no one prepared for. And so people were not necessarily very ready for. So I would just say going back is coming, but going back is never going to happen. What is that Tom Wolfe thing? You can never go home. It's not going to be the same. Like we're never going to be the same. So again, I would say using a problem solving matrix of some kind, like an actual set of like the 5 whys, whatever, right? Whether it's a PDSA, plan, do, study, act kind of cycle of inquiry, teaching your principals, working with them to do that with their community, with parents, with kids, with their staff, and unions, because for example, if I said, hey, there are parents and kids and whatever who just don't feel comfortable, and next year they're going to be people who want to do at-home learning, how do we do that? And then that I think pushes back on the district, Because, for example, if I have 30 third graders and you have 20 third graders and you have 10 third graders and you have 5 third graders who don't want to come back, I can't really, as a school, afford a teacher for 5 kids. Mm-hmm. But can the district, for example, create a virtual school and then look at the teachers in their district who want to teach in that virtual school, who had success teaching virtually? There
you go. There you go.
And again, I would be talking about that now with my folks. Like, if you're someone who likes this, you get your kids to do their stuff, right? So that's what I mean. Like, how does the district reimagine itself to serve kids? And I know that there are districts who are already thinking like this, even in Alameda County. And a lot of those districts are the more, I would say, kind of together, middle class, responsive to their communities districts. Because if you're out in Fremont or Pleasanton or whatever, and you ignore your community, they will burn you at the stake. Like, you won't have a job for very long there, right? And again, not to say that the outcomes are always good. Sometimes it ends up like the Berkeley High syndrome, where you end up like actually creating little baby schools within schools to make sure you don't have
segregation within under a building, basically segregation.
Correct. And so that's the other thing. Like, I remember when I first started as a principal and I had these parents, like, I had this woman from that parent group call me before my job started, like the day after my name was in the board packet, which I didn't even know was going to happen, which is a whole nother story. And said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so. I'm the principal of the president of the PTSA." I'm like, I gotta go, you know? And they were great. They wanted to do stuff. And I thought, and this is what I'll tell you about parents, you better give them something to chew on, or they're going to chew on you. It's just like kids, right? So they wanted, and I looked around, and I thought, this is the ugliest school I've ever seen in my life. I feel like I'm in some sort of a concentration camp building. And so I was like, what do you think of the facility? They're like, oh, it's horrible. I'm like, you could fix that. And they're like, okay. And so, boy, howdy, they sure took that to heart, right? But so, you know, it's that same thing. Like, let's give people something real that they want to do and fix and work on and kind of chew on, right? Like, there are going to be teachers who would be happy to be doing this. And again, like, running people through scenarios. What would it look like if some of your day was virtual, right? And some of your day was here? Or do you have half your kids at home and half your kids in the building, right? So my group of 4 is 2 kids in front of me, but 2 kids at home. Like, what are the different scenarios? And go through a sort of pros and cons and help people to pick, because we don't know. That's the other beautiful thing here. There's no magic. I'm not going to pull, you know, like Jeopardy. The answer is, we don't know what the answer is, right? Because no one's ever been here before. So if the answer is, I don't know, then we set up the parameters to say, okay, here are different scenarios. Can you think of more scenarios? And the scenarios have to do this. For kids who want to be here, kids who don't want to be here, adults who want to be here, adults who can't be here, you know, whatever your parameters are, and then have people do that imagining and then run those things through your sieves and then say, okay, we're going to try it. And this is how we're going to know if we're successful, right? Because what are our benchmarks to see if it's going good? How often should we look to see if we need to change things? Whether
is it the accountability-based budgeting that you were talking about?
Well, I'm not even talking about budgeting. I'm just talking about, like, just how do you reimagine what's going on in your building? And then I think you just have to start the conversation, I guess, with the union people. Like, will it be okay if some people are working at home and some people are working on site? And on some of those might be walls that we can't move. It's hard to say. Unions are very nervous about or can be anyway. Not all are like this. That's a whole nother thing. Like, every district has a very different culture, right, between their unions and the district. So, will it be okay? Can I have 16 kids that are here and 16 at home while someone else just has 32 kids in the room? Or, you know, I think that conversation should start now. Or you're going to find that it's a really hard conversation to have.
That's such a great point, Jamie, which is, you know, we have to start thinking now, but also, it's what I love of what you're naming about how to handle the situation with COVID is it's the same way we would handle any kind of school change question or classroom, even classroom level question. It's the same process. I think sometimes people get a little bit deer in the headlights about like, well, now this is a whole situation, different situation, so I need to use a different set of tools. But actually, it's the same kind of question, same kind of process. And I love hearing you describe what you would do, because it's like, okay, well, what are the constants? What are the things that can be flexible? How do I start to poke at that and ask questions? How can I think more creatively? What are the most urgent issues? And then how do I start to take them on one at a time and start moving through the process?
And I've always found that like when we did stuff at Brewer, teachers did stuff at Brewer that was outside of their contract. Totally. Never was it because I told them to. No. In other words, the district didn't come down and tell me this is what's going to happen. The principal didn't come down and say, you're going to do this during your prep at all. We simply had people sharing what each of the groups was doing, to like, here are your kids that aren't doing well, right? You know who they are. What are you going to do? Go talk about it, come back. What's your plan? And they all had to have like, what's your benchmark? How will you know kind of stuff. And then one group started doing this very creative thing. And this other group says like, can we do that? I'm like, sure. And these people were pulling kids during their prep. I couldn't get people to do that. And at first, I had a union rep at my school who's famous, still there. And the truth was the teachers proposed it. The teachers put it forward. The teachers were like, yeah, whatever, dude. And nobody grieved.
I think that gets to relationship always. And it's kind of where we are right now in this country is when people are not feeling heard or seen or acting from a place of fear, they retreat into the most regressive sort of minute counting. When people feel empowered and excited and interested, those things are still important, but they stop being the cage in which we're sort of stuck in. And exactly. So you have to have both. And as we're talking, I don't want to gloss over the fact that in California, we don't have enough, we don't pay for as much, right? Like that the ADA is so much lower than the rest of the country. And I do feel like we need to be putting that out there widely and getting our community really understanding the funding issue in a way that we start to invest in our schools in the way that other states are investing in their schools. And then I think sometimes people are shocked when they hear how much less money per year per student California gets compared to New York or Connecticut. And that of course that they're able to do so much, and money isn't everything, but if you can use this use this approach that you're talking about and then apply it with actually a reasonable amount of money. But if we're down to bare bones, by the time you get your budget, you just can only do what they're telling you have to do anyway. There's nothing left to be creative with.
Well, I think that's right, Susan. But I'd say that even beyond having more money, which I think we need, Jamie hit on an important point, which is actually we need stability.
Yes.
Because when you don't know how much money you have each year, it's impossible to plan a long-term strategy or intervention because you start to get people in and then the next year you lose them. And then, so
they even take money away in the middle of the year sometimes, right? Like sometimes you'll find out in January, you actually have $30,000 less than you thought, and you're going to have to lay this person off early.
So the budgeting roller coaster is the problem, because then you can't actually make a plan that you can follow through. And it's always somewhat willy-nilly. So you're right, we have more money this year, great, but actually the governor did come in and say, and we're going to give you, and you're going to have almost impossible testing standards for COVID. So that money's probably gone. But it's so hard to know like how to like when you have those windfalls, you don't get to keep them. And so then we end up spending it on like silly stuff, which I hate. Like my typical thing is like no shade really, but like the marquees in front of schools are a classic example of like, oh shoot, we have $10,000 before the end of the year, we have to spend it. We'll buy a marquee. So things that don't actually help kids, but it's like we have to spend the money and we don't know. And so I think that's a bigger issue to me.
Yeah, I've been in lots of those conversations with principals like, oh no, we have to spend this. Do you have any ideas? And I always have a lot of ideas. So, but it's not the best way to spend money. It's like, I got to spend it by next week. It's not good.
No. And I always took because you get your budget, supposedly in January. Then there's a May revise, which can like knock money out of your budget. So you've gone through this whole thing and planned this whole thing. And then in May, like a month before school's out, or June, or one year, it didn't happen until August, because I don't know, something was a hair up somebody's behind and they wouldn't approve it. But it's so crazy. And then you're right. Then they can go again and in January say, oh, actually, we didn't have that money. Sorry, and take it back. It's ridiculous. But yeah, we used to do, again, all kinds of creative things when I had money, and we were using, because I used software programs a lot from the beginning of my career. One of the first things at Westlake I did was buy this thing called Success Maker. It's no longer around, I don't think. And then Play-Doh and stuff like that, because kids are at all different places and they need these extra things. But anyway, and so I would make deals with the company like, hey, I got enough money to buy 3 years right now, but you can't write it up like it's for 3 years because you're only allowed to spend money in this year. So wait, am I going to get in trouble for this? Anyway,
no.
Not anymore.
No, but no, you're not going to get in trouble for it.
Not anymore. So they would like write the contract in this way for me. And then we had it for 3 years. So if I didn't get money next year, at least I had, something we could keep using for a minute. You know what I mean? Like we did that kind of create, just what you're talking about. Like, and
but you shouldn't have to do that. You shouldn't have to do that. That's the thing. And of course you were able to do that, but that's where we need to start to untangle things. I think
I agree.
That
this is,
you should know how much money you're going to get.
Conversation. We're already past an hour. I just wanted to.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No, it's not your fault. I could keep talking to you forever because I saw Susan getting pumped up. So I was like, we got to stop actually, because I think you're right. It shouldn't be this way. We shouldn't have to be a really savvy principal with a lot of experience because principal turnover is so high that by the time principals really have it going, they've moved on. And again, what these all land on are these like real inequities for our kids, but like it's just a roller coaster for them too. And it's
and that's
really
because these jobs are just not real. Like even teachers, like if you do what you need to do to make sure all your kids are learning like every day the best you can only do that so long before you are literally just kind of like a husk, right? So when teachers leave after 5 years, I'm like, right? Or even principals, 5 years. I was principal 5 years, and it felt like an eternity, right? It was so hard. And so we basically grind people up and spit them out, right? There's no time for learning within your day or your year. There's no, it's very, again, different than the way countries that actually, hold teachers in high esteem. I mean, in Korean, the word for teacher translates as nation builder, right? Like, and in Finland or something, less than 27% of people who apply to be teachers even get in. Like it's actually competitive because the salaries they make are commensurate with like doctors and engineers and civil, like nobody's making $2.5 million because everyone there thinks, why would you make that kind of money anyway? But you're all making what's a middle-class salary there, and you're respected, like all that, and you're funded to be able to do what you need to do, funding to sufficiency. And that's not how we do it in the United States, for sure, as well as training. All of that is, and that's why you have turnover like you have.
Yeah.
Right? So
I'm hoping for a better tomorrow, and that maybe
always,
all of these lessons that we have will actually upturn, the way that we approach education. Jamie, this has been such a joy to talk to you, and I feel like we should just have Jamie on as like a third party, and we'll just chat all the time.
I'm not even sure we talked about budget very much. Sorry.
It's all right. We talked a lot.
All of what you talked about. It is actually all the strategy. So, and at least this is the way you talk about budget is the way I talk about it, which is much more around process and strategy, less about the line items, because I think the line items are like the end of the line. They don't really matter as much as the strategy. So for me, that was powerful.
Yeah, I think we should end on the way that Jamie ended most conversations with me and everyone I know is love you, bye. Love you, bye. That was like every day. Love you, bye. Like, I love you. Get out of my office. I got stuff to do. Time's up.
Love you, bye. And I
we
didn't
do love
even
you,
know I
Jamie.
did
This
that.
was wonderful.
Thank you. I had a great time talking about this because I feel like the heroes of my life are teachers and administrators. And, I just, in my heart, like if teachers and administrators could see themselves as people on the same boat, rowing the same oar in the same direction, we just that in and of itself, we could do so much more, even with what we have. Like you are the heroes. All of you are trying your hardest. That's why you're there, right? Yeah. And when you put good people into a bad system, you shouldn't be surprised when the results aren't what you had hoped. And I think that's also kind of soul crushing for a lot of people. They really wanted to do something and make a difference, and were not able to move the machine. So let's move that machine, baby.
Let's move it.
Let's move that machine, baby.
Class is dismissed. Wasn't that fun? Susan and Megan are always happy to greet you on the next episode of The Awakening Educator. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Education is the foundation for a brighter future. Open your eyes to The Awakening Educator.